Here are some creepy horror stories. My personal favorite story pick is the astronauts on the moon, who find it unexplainable. Enjoy. There was an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a young girl who died in a fire that destroyed the house many years ago. One Halloween night, a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned house. They all gathered outside the gate and tried to open it, but it was locked. One of the teenagers suggested they climb over the fence and explore the house from the back. As they approached the back of the house, they noticed a faint light coming from one of the windows. They all stopped in their tracks, feeling uneasy and scared. Suddenly, the light grew brighter and brighter until it was a blinding white light. The teenagers saw the ghostly figure of the young girl standing in the window. She was wearing a white dress and had long black hair. Suddenly, the light disappeared, and the ghostly figure vanished. The teenagers were all terrified and decided to leave the house immediately. As they were leaving, they heard a faint whisper in the wind, "Get out of my house." From that day on, the teenagers never returned to the haunted house, and it remained abandoned, with the ghost of the young girl still haunting its halls. It was a warm summer night in the outback, and 5 friends had decided to camp out under the stars. They had set up their tents and started a campfire, enjoying the peacefulness of the wilderness. But as the night wore on, they began to hear strange noises coming from the darkness beyond their campsite. At first, they dismissed it as the wind or some nearby wildlife. But then they heard a blood-curdling howl that made their skin crawl. They huddled together, trying to reassure each other that it was just a coyote or a wolf. But then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its body twisted and contorted in an unnatural way. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its skin appeared to be shifting and changing before their very eyes. It was a skinwalker, and it was coming straight for them. They scrambled to their feet, trying to flee, but the skinwalker was too fast. It hunted them, its howls echoing all around them. They could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the rocks and sand as it closed in on them. They kept running for their lives, but to no avail, as they would hear less footfalls and a deathly scream coming from a friend who had been caught by the hideous creature. 2 of them made it back to the car to tail it out of there, but the other 3 were no more. As astronauts landed on the moon, they were excited to explore new terrain and collect samples, but as they stepped out of their spacecraft, they noticed something strange. There were footprints leading away from their landing site, footprints that didn't belong to them. Curiously, they followed the footprints and soon came across a sight that would haunt them forever. A group of dead bodies lay on the lunar surface, frozen and lifeless. The astronauts were horrified. Who were these people and how did they end up on the moon? As they examined the bodies, they realized that they were not human. They were creatures with elongated limbs and strange, otherworldly features. The astronauts couldn't believe what they were seeing. Had they just stumbled upon an alien race that had perished on the moon? The team quickly radioed back to Earth to report their discovery, but they were met with silence. No one responded to their calls. As they continued to investigate, the astronauts began to feel a sense of dread. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Soon, they noticed strange movements in the shadows. Something was out there, lurking in the darkness. The astronauts tried to stay calm, but fear began to take hold. They knew they had to leave the moon as soon as possible. As they made their way back to their spacecraft, they heard strange noises echoing through the crater. It sounded like something was following them. The team quickened their pace, their hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, they reached their spacecraft and took off, leaving the moon behind. But the memory of the dead bodies and the eerie feeling of being watched stayed with them long after they returned to Earth. The astronauts knew that they had discovered something terrifying on the moon, something that they might never fully understand. It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was alone in her bedroom. She had just finished watching a horror movie and was feeling a little uneasy. Suddenly, she heard a tapping sound coming from her window. She tried to ignore it, but the tapping became more persistent. When she finally mustered the courage to look, she saw a grotesque figure trying to force its way in through the window. It had red, glowing eyes and long, sharp claws. Sarah was frozen with fear as the creature slowly made its way into her room. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature was getting closer and closer, and Sarah could feel its hot breath on her face. Just when she thought it was all over, she woke up. It was all just a nightmare, or so she thought. As she looked towards the window, she saw a faint glow, and the tapping began again. She quickly realized that it wasn't just a nightmare. The creature was still trying to get in. It was a late Sunday night, and Jane had just finished reading a book about astral projection. Despite her skepticism, she decided to give it a try. She lay down on her bed, closed her eyes, and focused on her breathing. Suddenly Jane felt her body becoming lighter and lighter until she felt like she was floating above her bed. She looked down and saw her own body lying there, fast asleep. Feeling a sense of excitement, she decided to explore her house in her astral form. She floated out of her room and down the hallway, seeing everything from a different perspective. As she continued to float around her home, she began to feel a sense of unease. The air felt thick and heavy, and she could hear strange whispers in her ear. Suddenly, Jane saw a shadowy figure lurking in the corner of her living room. The figure had long hair, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. She tried to move away, but she felt like she was stuck in place. The figure began to approach her, and she felt a sense of terror wash over her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out and touched her, and Jane felt like she was being pulled back into her body. When Jane opened her eyes, she was back in her bed, sweating profusely. She realized that she had experienced something terrifying during her astral projection. She never tried it again, afraid that she might encounter the shadowy figure once more. As I was walking through the dark forest, I heard the sound of twigs snapping behind me. I turned around to see a figure in a hooded cloak with no visible face. It started to approach me slowly, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, it spoke in a deep, raspy voice. "I have been waiting for you, my dear. You are the one I have been searching for." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was frozen in fear. The figure came closer and closer, until it was right in front of me. It reached out with its bony hand and touched my face. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Then it whispered in my ear, "You will never leave this forest alive." The last thing I remember was a piercing scream before everything went black. One night, I found myself walking home from work later than usual. The streets were deserted, and the only sounds I could hear was the wind and rain beating on the pavement. As I walked down the deserted street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, but the feeling persisted. Then I heard footsteps. Walking behind me, I turned around, but there was no one there. I picked up my pace, but they seemed to get closer. I started to run, but they keep up pace. It felt like someone was breathing down my neck. I turned around one more time, and there was a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the street. I froze, unable to move. The figure started to move towards me, and I knew I had to do something, so I took a deep breath and ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I reached the safety of my home. To this day, I still don't know what that figure was or what it wanted from me. But I'll never forget the terror I felt on that late night walk.